27 years had passed since an entire fifth-grade class vanished during what should have been an ordinary school field trip. 15 young students, their teacher, and a staff member had boarded a yellow school bus one September morning in 1996, heading to Big Bend National Park. They never returned. The investigation that followed had been extensive but ultimately fruitless. Authorities suspected foul play, particularly focusing on Mr. Gregory, the classroom teacher who had disappeared alongside his students. Yet without bodies, witnesses, or substantial evidence, the case gradually went cold, leaving behind a community of shattered families and unanswered questions. Among those devastated families was Laura Calloway, whose 11-year-old daughter Rory had been among the missing children. Unlike some of the other parents who had eventually found ways to move forward, Laura remained consumed by the mystery, unable to accept that her bright, laughing daughter had simply vanished into thin air. The anniversary that changed everything. The morning of September 28, 2023, dawned gray and overcast, the cloudy sky reflecting Laura's heavy heart as she prepared for another painful anniversary. She had developed rituals over the years, visiting Rory's memorial grave, bringing fresh flowers, spending time with other bereaved families. The routine provided structure to an otherwise unbearable day. Laura stood before her dressing table mirror, where a photograph of Rory in her school uniform had hung for 27 years. The image captured her daughter's infectious smile, frozen in time just days before the tragedy. Laura's fingers traced the glass as tears threatened to spill. A text message from her closest friend, Helen Carter, interrupted her grief. Helen's daughter Sally had also been on that bus, and over the decades, the two mothers had formed an unbreakable bond forged in shared loss and mutual understanding. "You don't have to face today alone," Helen's message read. "Come over whenever you need to. We're all still here for you." Laura gathered some Earl Grey lavender tea and homemade cookies before making the short walk to Helen's house. The neighborhood looked remarkably unchanged from 27 years ago, a stark reminder of how time could stand still in some ways while racing forward in others. Helen greeted her with the kind of embrace that needed no words. They settled into the familiar routine of making tea and sharing quiet conversation, their friendship having been tested and strengthened by years of collective mourning. "How are you managing today?" Helen asked gently as they sat with steaming cups. "Same as always," Laura replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some days I think I've made peace with it, but then this date comes around and it all feels fresh again." Helen nodded knowingly. She had completed therapy the previous year and had found some measure of acceptance, though she admitted that anniversaries still brought waves of pain. The photograph that started everything. As they sat together, Helen suggested they look through some old photographs, a ritual that had become both painful and healing over the years. She retrieved a photo album from the TV cabinet and settled back onto the couch beside Laura. Most of the pictures were familiar: first days of school, birthday parties, family gatherings. But then Laura's attention was caught by an image she had never seen before. It showed Rory, Sally, and their classmates working on a science project during a school fair, their faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from discovery and learning. "This is beautiful," Laura said, her voice thick with emotion. "Where did you get it?" "From the police," Helen explained. "A few months ago, they released copies of evidence materials to the families. I went down to the station and requested everything they had." Laura was surprised. She had never known this was possible, and part of her wondered if seeing all that evidence would have helped or hindered her healing process. As they continued through the album, Laura came across another unfamiliar photograph, this one a class picture taken in front of the yellow school bus that would carry the children on their final journey. Laura studied each face intently, but then something caught her eye that made her heart skip. "Helen," she said, confusion evident in her voice, "why is Principal Lillian Brooks in this picture? I thought only Mr. Gregory and one support staff member went on the trip." Helen leaned in closer, examining the photograph. "You know, I remember hearing conflicting stories about that. Some parents mentioned the principal being there, but I never gave it much thought." Something about this detail gnawed at Laura. For 27 years, she had believed she knew the basic facts of that day. The idea that such a crucial detail might have been overlooked, or worse, deliberately obscured, sent a chill through her. Helen, recognizing the look of obsession creeping into her friend's eyes, gently placed a hand on Laura's arm. "Laura, I know what you're thinking. We've been down this road so many times before. Remember 3 years ago when you were convinced the bus driver was connected to that cold case in Oregon?" Laura felt a flush of embarrassment at the memory, but she couldn't shake her conviction that this was different. The photograph seemed to contradict everything she had been told about that day. "This photo was probably taken before the trip, on school grounds," Helen continued. "That would explain why the principal was there." Though Helen's explanation was logical, Laura couldn't dismiss her growing suspicions. She asked if she could take the photograph home, promising Helen she wouldn't let it consume her the way previous theories had. An impulsive decision. Later that afternoon, as Laura sat on the bus heading to town to buy flowers for Rory's grave, she found herself staring at the photograph. The more she examined it, the more questions arose in her mind. Why had some parents believed the principal went on the trip while others, like herself, had been told otherwise? On impulse, Laura tried calling Officer Jensen, the detective who had been assigned to the case years ago. When her calls went unanswered, she made a spontaneous decision that would change everything. Recognizing the neighborhood outside the bus window as the area where Principal Brooks lived, Laura got off at the next stop. She hadn't seen or spoken to Principal Brooks in years, and as she walked down the familiar street, Laura wondered if the woman even still lived there. The neighborhood had aged, with some houses showing signs of renovation while others displayed the wear of time. When Laura found herself standing in front of what she believed to be the principal's house, she hesitated. The garden was well maintained, and a car sat in the driveway, but she couldn't be certain she had the right place. Just as Laura was about to knock on the door, she noticed 2 women walking down the sidewalk toward the house. One appeared to be in her 30s, while the other was closer to Laura's age. As they approached, Laura immediately recognized the older woman as Principal Lillian Brooks, despite the years that had softened her features. The recognition wasn't mutual at first. Principal Brooks looked at Laura with polite confusion until Laura introduced herself. "I'm Laura Calloway," she said, watching as understanding dawned on the principal's face. "Rory Calloway's mother." The principal's composure slipped momentarily. She seemed flustered, ushering the younger woman inside while fumbling with her keys. Laura waited on the doorstep, growing more curious about the identity of the mysterious companion. When Principal Brooks finally returned to the door, she claimed not to immediately remember Laura's name, though her nervous demeanor suggested otherwise. "I'm Rory Calloway's mother," Laura repeated. "My daughter was in the grade 5 class of 1996. She disappeared during the school trip." The principal's face paled, and she struggled to maintain her composure. Laura couldn't help but notice how anxious she seemed, constantly glancing back at the woman inside the house. Contradictions and suspicions. Laura pulled out the class photograph and asked directly whether it had been taken at the school or during the trip. Principal Brooks studied the image, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I think it was during." She began, then quickly corrected herself. No, it was taken at the school parking lot." The hesitation was telling, and Laura pressed further. "Were you on the trip that day?" "No," Principal Brooks replied firmly. "I stayed at the school. Mr. Gregory and an administrative staff member went on the trip. It was supposed to be me, but I had an important last-minute matter to attend to." This aligned with what Laura had always believed, but something in the principal's manner continued to trouble her. When Laura asked if she had noticed anything suspicious about Mr. Gregory that day, Principal Brooks became defensive. "I've given all these statements to the police countless times," she said, her voice taking on an edge of annoyance. "I never would have thought Mr. Gregory capable of something like this. I would prefer not to speak about it anymore. It was heartbreaking for me too, and I've found closure. I don't want to reopen old wounds." Laura felt guilty for causing distress, but she couldn't shake her suspicions about the inconsistencies in the principal's responses. As she prepared to leave, Principal Brooks surprised her with a brief embrace. "I understand your pain, the principal said softly. It's one of the reasons I took early retirement. As long as I worked at that school, I could never overcome the grief. A chance encounter at the cemetery. Despite her unsatisfying conversation with the principal, Laura continued with her planned visit to the cemetery. She purchased flowers from her usual florist, where she unexpectedly encountered Helen and her husband Matthew. They decided to visit the graves together, providing mutual support on this difficult anniversary. At the cemetery, as Laura knelt beside Rory's headstone, a memorial marker over an empty grave, she arranged the flowers with loving care. The absence of her daughter's remains was a constant source of pain, a reminder that even in death, there was no true closure. As Laura stood to join Helen and Matthew at Sally's nearby grave, something in the distance caught her eye. A young woman was standing in the section of the cemetery where most of the missing children had memorial stones. She wasn't just passing through, she was standing quietly before one of the graves, her hands clasped as if in prayer. What struck Laura most was how familiar the woman looked. It was the same person she had seen at Principal Brooks' house earlier that day. Driven by curiosity and a growing sense that this was more than coincidence, Laura approached the woman. She was crying, her shoulders shaking as she stood before one of the graves. "Excuse me," Laura called out softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman turned, surprise and fear flashing across her face as she recognized Laura. She quickly wiped away her tears, as if trying to compose herself. "We meet again," Laura continued, her gaze steady. "I saw you at Principal Brooks' house earlier." The woman shifted uncomfortably, looking as though she wanted to escape. Laura sensed her distress and tried to be reassuring. "I don't mean to intrude," she said gently. "I come here every year on this day to grieve too." The truth unveiled. After some gentle questioning, the woman reluctantly revealed that she was also there to mourn someone connected to the tragedy. Laura noticed a small, framed photograph placed near one of the graves. The image was aged and blurred, but she could make out the outline of a young girl's face. As their conversation continued, the woman inadvertently mentioned Rory by name, speaking of her with a familiarity that stunned Laura. When pressed about how she knew Rory, the woman's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "Are you one of the survivors?" Laura asked, her heart racing as the pieces began to fall into place. The woman's immediate and vehement denial only reinforced Laura's suspicions. The resemblance between the woman and the girl in the photograph she clutched was undeniable. "You don't want to know who I am," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's better for everyone involved." But Laura couldn't let it go. 27 years of questions, of sleepless nights wondering what had happened to her daughter, had led to this moment. "Please," Laura pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. "I've never been able to understand my daughter's disappearance. It's been eating me alive. If you know anything, please tell me." Finally, the woman's resistance broke. "You're right," she whispered. "I'm one of the missing students. A survivor. My name is Audrey Whitman." Laura's heart raced as recognition flooded over her. Audrey Whitman, the name was etched on a headstone she had passed countless times during her visits to the cemetery. The conspiracy revealed. As the truth unfolded, Audrey revealed that she had been living in hiding for 15 years, ever since her escape from traffickers in Mexico. She had survived horrors that Laura could barely comprehend, and Principal Brooks had been helping her maintain a secret life, but at the cost of keeping the truth from the victims' families. "Principal Brooks said I'd only hurt everyone," Audrey explained through tears. "She said it was better if the families didn't know." Laura's world shifted as she realized the full scope of the deception. The principal hadn't just been hiding information, she had been actively concealing the survival of one of the children while allowing families to suffer in ignorance. With Helen and Matthew's support, and despite Audrey's initial reluctance, Laura convinced the young woman to contact the police. 27 years after the tragedy, the case was finally about to be reopened. Justice at last. At the police station, the truth came pouring out. Under interrogation, Principal Brooks confessed to orchestrating the entire tragedy. Deeply in debt to dangerous loan sharks, she had arranged for the school trip to be hijacked. The children were trafficked across the border into Mexico, where they were sold into various forms of exploitation. The male students had been sold overseas for child labor. The female students faced even worse fates. Audrey was the only known survivor, having escaped 12 years after her abduction. The revelation was devastating but also liberating. After 27 years of uncertainty, the families finally had answers. The truth was horrific, but it provided the closure they had desperately needed. Rory and Sally had died early in their captivity from drug overdoses, a small mercy, perhaps, given what might have awaited them otherwise. The knowledge was heartbreaking, but it allowed their mothers to finally begin the process of true healing. Epilogue. As Laura left the police station that evening, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. The grief was still there, perhaps even more acute now that she knew the full horror of her daughter's fate. But alongside the pain was something she hadn't felt in 27 years, peace. The uncertainty that had haunted her for so long was finally gone. She knew what had happened to Rory, and she knew that justice would be served. Principal Brooks would face trial for her crimes, and authorities in Mexico would investigate the trafficking ring that had destroyed so many lives. For Audrey, there was the promise of a new beginning. Witness protection would keep her safe as she helped authorities pursue the case further. After years of living in shadows, she could finally step into the light. The other victims' families would soon learn the truth as well. It would be painful, but they deserved to know what had happened to their children. The conspiracy of silence that had protected Principal Brooks and prolonged their suffering was finally broken. As Laura looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, she felt a shift within herself. The grief would always be there, but now it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. She would make sure that justice was served, not just for Rory, but for all the children who had been lost that day. For the first time in 27 years, Laura felt like she was finally on the path to something resembling peace. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer walking it alone, and she was no longer walking it blind. The truth, terrible as it was, had finally set them all free.